This episode brought to you by How to Write Manga, your complete guide to the secrets of Japanese comic book storytelling. Available wherever fine ebooks are sold.
The world has gone insane. Cosplayers rule the conventions. Gamers dominate the tabletop and the internet. Sci-fi subjugates the movies, and fantasy rules the bookstore with an iron fist. Only one group can bring order to this unruly mob. A team of uber geeks, masters of the nerdly arts, trained for decades in the hobby shops and basements of the nation. Mobilized by the secret masters, they are the Department of Nerdly Affairs.
Hello, operatives, and welcome to the Department of Nerdly Affairs. I'm your host, Rob Patterson, here with my co-host, Don Chisholm.
Who has a new computer, and I'm not very good at this, so strap in, kids, we're going for a ride.
Aren't we always, Don? Aren't we always? And tonight, we're going to be going east. At least, if you live in Europe. Simon Vale of Magic Dome Books has dropped by to talk to us about Russian science fiction. His company translates fine Russian science fiction for an English audience. Welcome to the show, Simon.
Hi, thanks for having me, and I'm happy to be here.
Not as happy as we are to have you, Simon. So, first, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. First of all, I have to explain something. Simon Vale is not my real name. I am Russian-born. I grew in Russia and never even have been in any English native-speaking country. It's just when I started working at Magic Dome Books very soon, I realized that I need to separate the various information incoming, and I mean information in English and in Russian, and this is how Simon Vale was born. My real name is Valerian Simakov. Maybe you have seen a movie, Valerian and the City of Thousand Planets by Luc Besson. So the first part is my actual name, and all my friends made at least one joke about how this is about me. Actually, I haven't seen it, so I don't know, but maybe.
That's pretty cool, although I kind of heard the movie's not really that good.
Yeah, I had the same thing, and, well, I guess nothing can beat The Fifth Element. It's a great movie by Luc Besson, I think, best of the best.
Definitely.
Well, I am 34 years old, and I'm the head of communications in a small publisher and literary agency called Magic Dome Books. We are relatively young, only 3 years old, but we are a very enthusiastic and passionate publisher. We already have published almost 50 books, mostly litRPG. And I know that you guys know what this is, because I listened to the episode of your podcast with my friend and colleague Ramon Mejia. And he explained it much better than I ever could have, even in Russian, so I won't bother you with it. Still, I'm proud to say that our books were among the first ones in this genre on Amazon and in the United States, in Canada, in Australia, in England, of course, in New Zealand. Before that, I worked as a brand manager for the biggest Russian publishing house, AST. And also there are 3 annual book fairs in Russia, and for 10 years already I'm working there as a host, interviewing authors, presenting books, etc., etc., etc. So many of Russian science fiction and fantasy writers I'm lucky enough to know personally. I can't say I'm a traditional Russian geek because I don't think there is a very distinctive social group that you can call that in Russia. But I'm a huge fan of science fiction and fantasy myself. Not just Russian, but world fantasy and science fiction.
Okay, then. So, Simon, why don't you tell us what's the difference between Russian fantasy and fantasy from other places, then?
Well, speaking about fantasy, I think that there is no big difference. Russian fantasy is having the same roots as every other fantasy in the world. Books by John Tolkien and John Rowling, Dungeons and Dragons tabletop games, and old computer games like Baldur's Gate or Eye of Beholder. There is also some national-based fantasy in Russia, and it is relatively popular, yes. Some authors do specialize on it. But it is much more complicated with science fiction. The way I see it is in the end of 19th century, world science fiction was mostly, positive. Human progress, improving medicine, magic of electricity, all that stuff. And on that positive basis, people once again tried to build the ideal modern society, but ended up building two horrible dictatorships, Nazi Germany and Soviet Union. And that's why world science fiction of the second half of the 20th century is all about disappointment. Disappointment in progress, which is not helping to solve every problem as it seemed before. But since Russia was one of those ideal societies, we couldn't afford such a view with censorship and all that. So when, Polish author Stanislav Lem wrote about how we can't communicate with any other alien forms because we are all we're looking in space is a mirror, or when Issac Asimov wrote about danger of artificial intelligence, or when Robert Heinlein wrote about hunger of the outgrown human population, all that time we kept writing about how great and kind people of the future will be. It was a little naive, but Soviet censorship just wouldn't allow anything else to be published. So when Soviet Union collapsed, that was all that we had in that moment. Maybe this is why post-apocalypse and cyberpunk genres are very popular in Russia. Dark science fiction, to balance things up with our inheritance. Maybe this, or maybe else, maybe because many Russian science fiction writers are former military people. Maybe this is also a reason, also the reason. And today's readers prefer fantasy. For past several years, we saw many young writers and many young women writers coming up to the stage, and they're writing romantic fantasy and young adult fantasy, this kind of stuff. So I think that Russian science fiction is dark, as I said, and much darker than I don't know about that, because I read a lot, not only Russian but also American and German and French and Chinese literature, and sometimes I come across very dark things, very dark books as well. But I think that you can say this about Russian literature. It is dark when coming to science fiction.
Yeah, I would agree. We had a weird thing when you mention the second half of the 20th century. Like here in North America, right after World War II, we had a period where all of our science fiction was upbeat, and it was all like, it's often referred to as the atomic age, where atomic power will fix all of our problems and we'll wear silver jumpsuits in space. And that didn't last too long.
Of course, I understand. That's the same thing I'm talking about. Of course, because people's problems, real problems, inside problems, they are different. They can't be solved with progress, with technologies. On the contrary, progress raising much more new questions in addition to the old ones.
It actually sounds like science fiction and even science fiction heroes are kind of universal, or at least they were for a while.
Yes, it does. Yeah, maybe because this inheritance that I told you about, it is pretty strong even now in Russian literature. And the most famous Russian science fiction authors, they both dead by now. They called Strugatskie brothers, two brothers, Arkady and Boris Strugatskie, and they are like wildly popular in Russia. Every Russian science fiction writer must learn them by heart, and when someone wakes him at night, he must remember all the details from every book of those authors, and they're really great. I love those books, but they also always describe these people of the future, kind and great, and showing sympathy to others, helping others, that kind of things. So these heroes, they are transferred from that time. They are transferred into modern Russian literature. Sometimes that happens, yes.
I confess, I've actually never heard of the Strugatsky brothers. Do you think they were well known at one time in English?
Maybe not. I'm not sure. I think they are translated. I'm sure they are translated, but one of them was translator himself. He was an interpreter into Japanese. And I know they are translated into Japanese. And of course, they are translated into English, but I'm not sure. Russian literature is really self-centric sometimes. I mean, in language sense, first of all, there are many language references inside it, and cultural and historical references that sometimes readers from United States or Canada or other countries, any other countries, in fact, they can't understand them, or they need to open a textbook, history textbook, and to search for answers. So I think many senses are lost when you're reading Russian classics such as Strugatsky brothers. But on the other hand, they are great book in the sense of action and adventures, traveling, that kind of stuff. One of them, as I told you, was a translator, and the other one was astronomer. So they really knew their stuff. They really knew what they were writing, and this is pretty strong literature, without any doubts.
Wow, I'd love to read them. So, if someone was going to start out reading the Strugatsky brothers' work, where would they start?
Oh, this is a very, very difficult question, because there are like 30 books. I think they wrote them for 30 years. There are famous books and there are my favorite books, and they are not the same things.
Well, why don't you just give us a few of the major titles in English?
Well, perhaps I can name the book, but I'm not sure how to translate the title. In Russian, the most famous book in Russian called Ulitka na skloni, and that means snail at the, slope, mountain slope. I'm not sure this translation is accurate at all. But there is such a book, and this is a great book, without any doubts. But my favorite book, I believe that will be It's Hard to Be a God. There is such a book. It's Hard to Be a God, and it is about another planet. And people from Earth are coming to this planet to help people living on it, because there are middle ages over there on that planet.
A middle-aged society.
And people from Earth are trying to help them. And they face, of course, not just many difficulties, but they, with time, they start themselves looking like people from that planet, you know. They get barbaric, they get cruel, they get evil because influence of this planet, of this place, of these manners, it all influences them very much. And this is a great novel. It raises many really big and difficult questions. And of course, I can recommend it.
That was part of there was a series, wasn't there?
It's Hard to Be a God. I don't think so. There was a series. It was a single book by those authors. It was there's theme, as you can say, because maybe we can find part of this plot of this problematic in their other books. But there were no series. But I can say you that portal science fiction and fantasy, when someone is transferred to other planet or to other dimension and tries to survive there, this is a very popular plot in modern science fiction Russian and classic Russian science fiction. It is very popular.
Huh. Okay. Because I do remember Hard to Be a God they did translate it in English. Because I remember, this is going back. This would be back to the 70s.
Yes.
Yeah, it was one of those books here that if you were a serious sci-fi fan, you were familiar with. But if you were like a casual fan, you've probably never heard of it.
I know what you're talking about. For me, from your part of the world, and especially from Canada, I read for about a year now, I guess. I read Blind Side by Peter Watts. I don't know if you know this author. He's Canadian, and this is really hard science fiction with big capital science in it, and I enjoyed it very much. This is like, I don't know, the best science fiction novel I read in years.
That's awesome. But I have a horrible feeling he's one of those Canadian writers that only people who are really into science fiction know.
Well, anyway, the only other Canadian author I know is Douglas Copeland. He's not, well, I'm not sure this could be described as science fiction, but maybe, you know, Generation X, his famous book.
I think really he'd be more like social commentary. He was actually pretty big back in the 1990s, but I don't think he's done very much recently. Actually, one science fiction writer you should definitely check out is Robert J. Sawyer, who did a book called Flash Forward. It got turned into a TV series a few years ago.
I didn't know he was Canadian.
Yeah, him and William Gibson would probably be two of our best, or at least best known science fiction writers. And of course, Margaret Atwood.
Yep. I'm writing it down right now. And thank you very much, because I always seek for recommendations to read something new. And I think I heard about the TV series. Yes, you said the name, the title.
Flash Forward?
Yes. I've seen it. Unfortunately, it wasn't, how do I say it, continued after the first, or maybe after 2 seasons. It had amazing, brilliant, premise. But when the things start to, unwrap, maybe it wasn't as good as the start. This first, this first idea, this first of the flashback.
Flash forward, actually. And because they're looking forward in time. I think in the original novel, it's like 20 years or something like that. They look into the future. Whereas in the TV show, it's just like 6 months or a year or something. And the original story takes place around CERN, where in the TV show they take place, I think it's about normal people.
I see.
So it's quite different, actually, between the two.
I think maybe he shouldn't do the whole series. He should just maybe have sold his idea to Black Mirror producers or creators to create one but great episode.
So that brings up an interesting question. Did you ever have a series like Star Trek in Russia? You know, an epic science fiction series that caught people's imagination and attention?
Not a single one, I think. Maybe we have something fantasy-based, not even fantasy-based, but fairy tale, Russian fairy tale based, maybe. Science fiction wasn't the strongest part of Russian television ever. And I know amazing Canadian TV series like Babylon 5 or, if I'm not mistaken, Lexx, Lexx about the...
Actually, Babylon 5 was American. Sorry.
Yeah, really? Okay, so Lexx, okay. Then just Lexx. It was an amazing series, and I love it very much because, all the space series and space books, but mostly space movies are horrors, mainly horrors. But Lexx wasn't a horror. It was, it was different with all the biotechnology and sex combined together in one wild beverage. It was great, and I love it. But unfortunately, there are no Russian good series. We are trying now to shoot something like that in Russia, but so far I can't see any interesting things in there. Maybe because we are trying to do it like American guys do, because when Soviet Union ceased to exist, was no more, there have been, cultural emptiness in Russia. And this emptiness was filled with Western culture. First of all children that were born after 80s or in 80s, they were growing on Star Wars and Star Trek and all that stuff, of course. Maybe that's also one of the reasons why there are no good Russian series so far, but I hope maybe some time will pass and we'll see them.
Yeah, because there's been and I'm not sure if this is just because we're just starting to see more of it here, but it seems like in Russia and Eastern Europe in general, there's been just in the last few years like a lot of companies that have been getting into science fiction and science fiction productions. Is that something new, or is that just something we're just becoming aware of here?
I'm not sure about science fiction in general, but for example, there is a great Polish fantasy series, and you probably know it. It is called The Witcher. And even if you don't know the books, the book series, you might know the computer game, of course, The Witcher. And this is a series by famous Polish author Andrzej Sapkowski. Personally, I think that's like maybe the best fantasy story in the world. I'm not kidding. It's even better than Game of Thrones, and Game of Thrones is very popular in Russia. Any piece of news about Game of Thrones are always in all major Russian mass media. But still, this novel, The Witcher, I don't know why, but it's not very popular in United States. I mean books. And in Britain as well. And I hope that may be changed because, as you might know, Netflix announced a series based on these books by Andrzej Sapkowski, The Witcher, and I hope that this is going to be next Game of Thrones. That is going to be a big with big money, with amazing special effects, with computer graphics, with all that stuff, and because the books are really, really good. I'm not sure why they aren't so popular. Maybe it's a language problem. I'm not sure, but maybe. And it is easier to translate from Polish into Russian than into English. That's for sure.
I'm looking forward to it. So, Simon, what's the science fiction publishing market like in Russia?
Well, you see, I have to say that Russian publishing market had seen better days. In 90s, average number of copies for fantasy novel easily could be 25, 50,000 of copies, even more. And today it's more like 5,000 of copies. Wow. I mean paper editions. Our big problem is the market itself. We have only one big publisher, which is publishing like, 2/3 of all books in Russia. Up until recently, we had two, but they merged together, and now we have one. It is hard to work on that market, first of all, because Russia is very big. Most books are printed in western part of Russia, so when you need to deliver them to the east, it costs like a fortune. Of course, people do read digital books, but here we are coming across another big problem, piracy. Piracy is very, very strong in Russia, and people aren't yet got used to the fact that they should pay money for books. They just download them from the internet and reading them just like that. And unfortunately, Amazon is not on Russian market. You can buy books on Amazon, but they don't have, Russian department. So it's hard for authors to work with Amazon. So there are some self-publishing companies in Russian. One of them, in fact, is coming to US soon, I think. It is called litnet.com.
Oh, okay.
And the idea of it is simple. Author can gather money for the book while writing it. So he writes chapter, he uploads it to this litnet.com, and the reader he pays a small fee and get access to the page with the book. So it's a little like blog maybe. But this is real books, and after they are done, often they are published by this our big and lonely publisher in Russia. But you can't make really decent money with that publisher. Russian author of average popularity gets like $1,000 or $2,000 for one book. So it's very and considering that you're writing this book for 5-6 months, maybe even a year, if you get only like $1,000 or $2 for this kind of work, who would want to become a writer? Yeah. So people trying some different ways. Many Russian authors are having their own bookstores. They're making their own sites and trying to sell books through these sites. And also this LitNet and a few other services in the internet allow to sell books in Russia. But in general, I would say, as I begin, Russian book market had seen better days, that's for sure.
Right.
So does this mean that Russian readers are generally not interested in books anymore, at least not of the paper kind?
Well, they do read books, but first of all, they do read, mostly light science fiction and light fantasy. Like, for example, at a book fair I was working a couple months ago, and I was presenting a book series. It was a romantic fantasy about dragons in space. Can you imagine it? It was about dragons. It was romantic. And all those dragons, I don't know, they loved each other in space or what, I don't know. That sounds
Wow.
really crazy. But for some reason, people do read it. I don't know the statistics. I don't know how many young people are reading right now. In Soviet times, there was not a rumor, but I don't know, not a rumor, but an opinion maybe that Russia is the most reading country in the world. I don't think it was true even then, though we had very big numbers of copies of every book that was published, maybe even hundreds of thousands. But that doesn't mean people really read all this or read all this. I'm not sure. But today, I guess it's maybe just like in any other country, maybe a little less, maybe a little more than somewhere. I'm not sure, but I don't think there is big difference.
Now the when somebody does work for like the big publisher, that how much of the rights to their material do they keep?
Well, usually they keep rights, at least nowadays, they keep rights for digital sales to them, and for movie production and computer games production, they also keep rights to themselves. Nobody sells it to big publishers because well, maybe I'm not sure, but I think because the big publisher allows them to do that. They don't pay writers very big money, as I told you, and so there is no reason, to give them all the rights, People prefer to get through this by themselves. And to make a computer game, it's one of the ways to the Western reader, as we already talked about The Witcher. And there is another example, is a very famous series in Russia. It is called Metro 2033.
Okay.
And there is a game, Metro. Maybe you heard about it. And the series is it's not series by a single author. This series, the first book of it was written. The first three books of it were written by Dmitry Glukhovsky. But then he made it like multi-author series. He invited many authors, and there were many, I think about 50, 60 books, and there are 2 computer games. They both are made by companies, maybe even in Czech Republic, or maybe in Poland. I'm not sure, but I think it was Czech Republic. Yes, because there is big and very good computer games making company in there. They're making really well. You've seen the Witcher, and it's a very beautiful game. with amazing graphics, with amazing effects, with amazing, everything. So they keep making those games, and this is the way for Russian author to become international.
Okay, because we've noticed that with writers in similar positions in other countries, like Japan. A lot of them are starting to move into doing like the animated TV shows, and China is another place where it looks like they're starting to work the novels into video games more than anything else.
Video games, television, you name it. The Chinese are trying to turn it into a media property because it makes money.
Yeah, maybe that's because I heard that in China, their TV and their is very local, very, very Chinese. They have very little Western movies, Western culture on their TV. Despite the fact that, for example, I don't know, Peking is an international megapolis with tons of tourists and foreign companies and people. Their TV is still very, old-fashioned, local, Chinese-oriented.
Well, maybe Russia should try doing the same thing.
Yeah. Well, Russian government is dreaming of making something of the sort in Russia, but so far it's very hard because for 30 years, I think, yes, for 30 years, there are tons of Western product in Russia. I mean, digital product like movies and series and computer games and all that stuff. And you can't just, ban it today without serious consequence.
Well, maybe we need a big push the other way. Maybe we need more Russian stuff being translated into English, like your company is doing.
First of all, Russian fantasy and science fiction authors they have a community for themselves. Yes, for Russian science fiction and fantasy authors, and there are like not like Comic-Cons, but like fantasy cons. Conventions, yes, something like that, and all those authors, they are meeting there. They all know each other. They, of course, hate each other, just as I think maybe all around the globe. But still, they drink together. They talk together. They, stealing ideas from one another. Of course, and I know many of them. I know many of them personally, and my colleague and founder of Magic Dome Books, Alex Bobel, he is an author himself. He's an author of some very popular series in Russia, post-apocalypse genre. So when he started Magic Dome Books, he was just trying to do something new with this horrible situation on the Russian book market. So he translated one of his books into English and tried to post it on Amazon and to post some announcements on the net, on Goodreads, on forums, etc., etc. And suddenly it was a success. And then we translated some litRPG in English, and it was a major success because, the word itself, the word litRPG is coming from the title of Russian book series, you have an episode dedicated to it, so I think this is success.
Yes, that was just incredible timing. I mean, the very first litRPG novels that I read were actually Russian litRPG novels. And I think it's already known kind of as a Russian genre in some ways. So you really came along with the right product at the right time to actually tap into a great market.
Well, I think we got lucky, without a doubt. And the idea of the genre itself, it wasn't ours. The idea belongs to South Korea, and it came in Russia from there. But we, what we made, we merged traditional book narration with this. With gaming elements in form of a big European novel. Because in South Korea, in Japan, in China, there are mostly manga or short novels, and litRPG there also are mostly short novels like Moonlight Sculpture. So this was our only advantage. We put it into big novels like we used to. Yes, and we got lucky. It became popular, and it becomes popular, more popular, and more every day now. And there is a movie coming up, by Steven Spielberg, Ready Player One. It's litRPG, maybe not litRPG technically, because in litRPG you always have these, stats and experience points, level ups, all that stuff right inside the text. So maybe not a traditional litRPG, but basically, of course, this is litRPG. So it wasn't our idea. It just happened to make it in a new shape, maybe.
Interesting. Well, I know that while the market is changing for at least a little while there, when people thought about litRPGs, they definitely thought about Russian works. I think the Russians were at the forefront of a lot of the development of the whole litRPG genre.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. Well, today the situation is different because American readers and writers are amazingly enthusiastic and passionate about their work, and today we're having maybe 500 titles of litRPG by, mostly US and Canadian and English writers. And we are taking a small and modest, but, a proud place in that not sure in that pyramid, in that ladder, in that building of litRPG.
Yeah.
But we hope to keep it.
So is your company also translating English books to Russian? I mean, there must be a lot of good ebooks being produced in English that would also be popular with a Russian audience if they could just be translated and reach it.
I often am asked this question, and no, we are not translating anything right now into Russian. Well, first of all, because, as I told you, there are great problems on Russian book markets, so it is very hard to sell more than 3,000-4,000 of copies of the book, and the translation costs enough to overcome the money you're getting of it. So it doesn't really make sense. We, of course, in Russia, there are many translated books, and some of them are translated very good. I'm not sure why, but somehow Russian and even Soviet Union translation school was very, very strong. We've got very much authors from all over the world. And in Russia, many of them are very popular. People do read foreign literature, and I think that, it's very good. Russian readers and Russian writers are very perceptive to international ideas, themes. They combine, they read, they mix it up, and I think this is very good. But no, for now we're not translating because we're not big. We are only 4 people for now. So it's hard to get our hands everywhere we want to. But maybe a little later we'll do that.
Well, I hope you do, because I think there's a real opportunity there for anyone who wants to take ebooks that are popular and then translate them legitimately, like you guys are doing, of course. And it lets better and better translations pop up all around the world of books that might not reach different audiences.
Yeah. Well, I hope so too. I hope so very much, because this is a very, really amazing instrument for every author, and Amazon should be everywhere. That's for sure. Maybe in addition, I can say that, for example, Peter Watts and his Blind Side, it is really difficult book to translate. And the second part of it, the echopraxia, it is not as good in Russian translation as the first book. And I know why, because it is really hard to translate, and it takes at least, several editors with special education in biology to, just get through the stuff so it makes sense in Russian at all. Not just translator. And when we are translating litRPG, it's much more easier, because people all over the world are playing MMORPG, and they are all the same in all countries. There are no problems to get terms from the game and to translate them to other language. No problem at all. But with hard science fiction, it's much more complicated.
Yeah. Oh, I was going to say, too, one of the things that I've noticed with, I don't have a huge amount of experience with, Russian sci-fi, but what I've seen that kind of makes it different from a lot of the rest of the world is that a lot of stuff, we grew up here in Canada with a lot of American stuff, and it tends to be very flashy, and you've got, the superheroic hero, whereas a lot of the Russian stuff seems to be, I'd have to say it's much more grounded. That there seems to be less of an interest of portraying heroes as somehow super people that are better than everyone else, as they tend more often to be average people who kind of, through a mix of wits and luck, manage to do okay where they're at.
Yes, I think you're right. Well, the traditional, typical Russian hero is, in Russian, it is called durak. In English, it is, idiot. Idiot who got lucky, who gets lucky all the time, a fool, a brilliant fool. And this is typical Russian hero, and we haven't traditional U.S. heroic literature. We haven't comic books at all. And of course, we know all the heroic theme by movies, and we watch all these movies. But movies that's it. It's just movies. No books. No heroic books. No comic books. Just movies.
So, do you mean that there's no Russian comic book market at all?
There is, but it is very, 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 very small. There are some Russian comics. Sometimes they are based on Russian classics like Dostoevsky, Chekhov, Tolstoy. These are not even comic books, but some weird product. I'm not sure even how to describe it. But there is no science fiction or fantasy comic books in Russia at all.
Ouch.
Ouch. Well,
So, is there a reason why there is no popular Russian comic book market?
I'm not sure. Well, how this happened, because in Japan they have manga, in America they have comic books, but in between them in Russia we have none of it.
Wow.
I'm not sure how this happened.
Yeah, kind of what's been happening here in North America with our comic books for the last decade. The big companies like Marvel, DC, they're kind of ignoring the comic book because the audience has been diminishing. But thanks to online, we've had this big boom in webcomics that in some ways it's closer to the comic strips, how they used to be in our newspapers, that a lot of the guys will publish. It'll be like a 3 or 4 panel strip, and sometimes they'll continue. You'll get one every day or every couple days. But the online thing is doing good. But because it's so spread out, so diversified, there are no real, well, there's a couple, but there aren't very many big hits. So you get, you've got, it's everybody reads it, but nobody's reading all the same stuff. So every comic has its own little fan base.
Yeah, in general, I'm afraid American comics are pretty much dying, unfortunately.
I see.
Well, there's one American exception, and that's Archie. Archie.
Yeah. I know. I know this one. When I'm watching, Big Bang Theory, and they're all going to the comic book store, and they're all grown-ups, and I understand these geeks are a little bit cliche, like kind of a cliche, of course. But still, I thought that movies must help a great deal to spread the word about comic books, because these movies, I don't know, Iron Man and Batman and Superman, they are not just for children. Yes, they are for family viewers. Family views. And isn't it working like someone comes to the movies with his son or daughter and watching Iron Man, and then they want to read comic book? No, it's not working this way.
Yeah, what ended up, it doesn't work like that here, because what ended up happening in the 80s and the 90s was the big companies like Marvel and DC moved specifically to specialty stores that sold nothing but comic books. And that meant the average person never really encountered them. Like when I was a kid, you'd buy them everywhere. You get them at stores, you'd get them at like magazine shops.
Supermarket.
Yeah, and when they moved to the comic shop, more and more it became just very specific fans of comic books that would go there. So the average person had nothing to do with it. And then they ended up back by the end of the 90s, they didn't attract a new generation of readers. The Japanese stuff did. So that's when they kind of started dying off.
And I see.
And people still think of that. When they think of comic books, Iron Man is a movie. If there's a comic book, they think The Big Bang Theory. It's in that weird store where only these like weird old guys go.
I see. Well, good to know.
Yeah. Unfortunately, what happened is that Marvel, in order to try to chase a newer, younger audience at the expense of an old one, decided to swap out all of their major characters for newer, younger, more diverse versions of them. And for various reasons, this hasn't worked. Part of it is that if you're a parent and you take your kid to a comic shop right now, you will find a character, a Captain America or an Iron Man or a Thor, that looks nothing like the character in the movies or the one you grew up with. And so as an end result, the parents are just turning around and walking right back out of the store without buying anything. Or at best, maybe buying some classic graphic novels, but not new stuff at all. And you can't really blame them because that's not what the audience wants. At least that audience.
Okay, I understand. And what about model train stores? Are there any in U.S. and Canada for now?
Well, there are model train stores. The modeling hobby does still exist, but it's a pale figment of what it once was. it's no longer a major hobby of any kind. It's really just a minor hobby that mostly my parents' generation and old guys are into. I don't see it attracting much blood. We have them, but just not many.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of sad, but that's the way it is, unfortunately.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had no idea.
So,
Yeah.
do you have like model train stores there in Russia? Is like modeling a hobby that Russians are interested in at all?
Well, I never been in Russian model train store. Maybe they do exist. I'm not sure, but I don't think so. Anyone who is enjoying this kind of activity, they should go to Germany or I don't know, France or US and go to the store there.
Right. Well, or they
Yeah.
could go to Japan. I mean, Japan is on. They love model trains.
Or Japan, sure,
Yeah.
sure. Well, Germany is much closer than Japan or US, so.
So, what do Russians do
Yeah.
then? Like, what kind of nerd hobbies do you guys have, or are there any?
Nerdy hobbies, the most popular is, of course, computer games. Without any doubts. And Russian computer game players, I mean professional players who participate in championships and win big games, they are, relatively high in ratings all over the world. Of course, they can't beat gamers from Korea or China because those guys are just like robots. They play like robots, and you can't beat them. But still, Russian players are good, I think. And computer games are, of course, one of the most popular hobbies for Russian geeks. And books. Without comic books, we are having just simple books, like traditional novels, science fiction and fantasy and, speculative fiction and steampunk, and there are much, irony, fantasy, not sure what the word is, sarcastic fantasy, sarcastic science fiction. It is also popular in Russia. When I was young and in 90s, when Lord of the Rings books were like wildfire, they were amazingly popular in Russia, and even in Moscow, we have in the center of Moscow, we have this big park, and every Thursday, many hundreds of people gathered there. They put on their costumes of fantasy characters, and they played these games when they recreate situations from the books. They made weapons, they fight these weapons, and this is a popular sport even today, the Middle Age swordsmanship. I don't know how to call it. It is popular, yes, in Russia. I think that's it. Mainly, about hobbies, at least about, these specific geek hobbies.
I was wondering too. In Russia, what about the the tabletop role playing games and war games? Is that like a big thing, or?
It was a big thing. We have never had, the stuff for it. Like action figures and, little monsters made of plastic and maps and special dices. All those things came in only recently. Well, maybe, 10 years. Yes, of course, in 90s they were very popular, but players just gathered together. They each took a sheet of paper and a pencil, and they took simple dices, with just eight sides of them, and they played classic Dungeons and Dragons. And there are some tabletop games, not Dungeons and Dragons, like Warcraft on popular franchises. There are such games. They are not extremely popular, but people do play them still and buy them, and there are stores where you can buy them. And today you can buy them with all the necessary stuff like these figures, etc., etc. And yes, people do like them.
Yeah, because that was I have kind of a problem with the tabletop gaming miniatures. I'm a huge fan. And I've noticed just the last 4 or 5 years, there's been a bunch of different companies that seem to have just started up, like in Russia and Eastern Europe, and they do fantastic stuff. I order all the time.
I've seen some TV report, maybe just yesterday, about a guy in Britain who collected thousands of these miniatures and maps and all that stuff. He gathered them for over 30 years, and he's playing the same big, amazingly big scenario. He's trying to make it really, really perfect. So he gathered everything on the matter he could lay his hands on, and now he's just spreading it wider and wider. He's making it bigger and bigger, like this big, very long, very difficult story, and he invites his friends from all over the world to play with him through Skype. Or they are just visiting him, so they're going down to the basement, and there is this very big table, and on this table there are mountains, rivers, woods, any kind of monsters, and this big story. And it looks really fun. I'm not really into this stuff now. I was back in 90s, but now I'm not playing that much in Dungeons and Dragons. But this seemed like a very fun thing to do. Well, at least, I don't know, for a couple of evenings. And I wish he invited me. Maybe I should write him.
Yeah, why not? Why not join? Actually, that sounds a lot like Don's house.
Yeah, that kind of does, I gotta say.
Don has a huge model kit and figure collection. In fact, he bought a house just to hold all of his collection.
Well, that is interesting.
And he plays games with them too.
Especially if you really have all the necessary things, the surface, woods and mountains and dragons and and cards and I don't know, wands. What else? all those things. If you put them together, this should be really fun.
Yeah, Don's house looks more like a museum than it does actually a house. He has pretty much everything you could possibly imagine, and dolls and toys and model kits, and it's a little bit of a kid's wonderland in there.
Oh, maybe I come visiting someday into Canada, because I love to see that.
Yeah, people are usually entertained and or horrified by the things in my house.
I think you don't have dogs like Rob, because they could, I don't know, chew all the miniatures, bite off heads from dragons.
And the tails. Dogs' tails are the most dangerous things of all for any kind of hobby.
And they don't do it on purpose, so you can't really blame them, but yeah, dogs' tails are really, really annoying.
Yep.
I've lost more than a few toys and things to dogs' tails over the years. Anyway, so let's get back on track. So listeners want to start reading Russian science fiction. Where's the best place to start?
The best way to start would be, I believe, to maybe learn Russian, because it is very hard to find good translation and books on Amazon from Russian companies, from Russian writers, first of all. But I think that... of course, and you should start with books by Magic Dome Books. Of course, you can start with the Way of the Shaman series, or the Dark Herbalist series, or Mirror World. These are our big three series, and they are best-selling series. They're really interesting. They are really full of adventures and action and everything that should be in a good book. And if not to take our books,
hold on
perhaps...
a sec. Simon, could you take a moment and tell us about some of your company's big titles? Tell us more about them, so our readers know what to expect.
The Way of the Shaman series, you read it, it's about a man who is sentenced to spend several years inside a computer game, and he is trying to make a living there, working as a jewel maker. This book is really full of twists, and it was really, it was really inspired. Vasily Mahanenko is one of the pioneers of litRPG in Russia, and he is famous mainly because he works with the gaming system inside his books. Very, very accurate. And for a litRPG author, it is very important, So the statistics, the gaming points or experience or all that stuff, it shouldn't be just, put here and there. Here's level, there's some points, and none of it makes sense. It should be a very distinctive and accurate system, and reader must understand why this is happening and what are the consequences for all these numbers you see and all these tables. And Vasily Mahanenko, without a doubt, is the master of this system creating. The other series, The Dark Herbalist, it is an attempt to write a book about non-human with non-human lead. Inside the game, the main hero is a goblin. He's a goblin, and he is also a vampire. So he can't lift big and heavy swords or axes. He can't crush his enemies with his fists. He's small, he's weak, but he is smart, and he has a lot of dexterity. So he's good with that kind of stuff. And that is very good because there are many litRPG now on the market, and mainly they are picking simple and ordinary classes of characters, like, humans, elves, etc. And not many books today are showing different races, tricky races, and different tricky classes as well. And Dark Herbalist is all about that. And of course, litRPG books are, they always have like two worlds, like real world and gaming world. And the tricky part is to keep both worlds on the surface, not just to concentrate on one world, on gaming world or on real world. They should be worked through both, and the plot must merge them together in some way. And the Dark Herbalist is doing it very, very good. And what others? And maybe the third series I'm going to tell you about is Mirror World by Alexei Asatchuk, one more author under the Magic Dome and he's living not in Russia, he's living in Spain, though he is a Russian author, but he's living in Spain and write his books over there. And this series, it's also an amazing series, but it have another advantage because there is a very good developed human interest in the series, because the main hero, he's working inside the game, trying to collect money for heart transplantation for his daughter, where he has a little daughter, and she has problem with her heart. And he's trying to collect money, working as a miner inside gaming world. He's Mr. Family Man. He is not ordinary player of computer games. He's not like Geek or someone who tries to conquer the world inside the game or to lead armies. He is just trying to solve his real life problem inside this world, and it is also very, very good. And personally, I think that every book must have this human interest, inside it. Absolutely. That's one of the key aspects of a good book. And Mirror World by Alexei Sachuk, it has it all.
Interesting.
Well, that's it. We have one more, maybe I'll tell you short, one more series. It is called Phantom Server. There are 3 books. It is completed. And tomorrow we are releasing the 3rd book of the Neuro series by the same author, Andrei Levadny, he's called. And this series is a prequel to this Phantom Server series. So it was at first 3 books of Phantom Server series, and then, like Star Wars, 3 books of prequel to that series. And it is a little different because it is sci-fi litRPG, not fantasy like previous books I told you about. They're all fantasy litRPG with fantasy gaming worlds inside them. And books by Andrei Levadny, they are science fiction litRPG. There are space, there are aliens, there are it is like dark and hard science fiction with all when people facing consequences. Oh, this is the hard word. Consequences of human progress, of virtual reality, of gaming, of addiction to computer gaming, all that stuff.
Huh. Sounds a little different because that sounds more like the cyberpunk style stories from like the 80s.
It is cyberpunk without a doubt. It is litRPG because all the stats and tables are in there as well. But of course, this is cyberpunk because Andrei Levadny, he's a very dedicated to cyberpunk genre author, and he wrote almost 100 books. He's 50-something years old, and he wrote like almost 100 books, and they are all cyberpunk.
Oh, wow.
He's very dedicated to the genre.
Yeah, and that's interesting, too, because you don't, with the litRPG, yeah, now that you mention it, I don't know if I've ever seen a science fiction one before.
Well, we have 2 series of science fiction litRPG. One of them, Perimeter Defense by Mikhail Atamanov, the same person who wrote the Dark Herbalist series. And it is also science fiction. It is based on the famous MMORPG EVE Online. Well, a little bit based on it because it is a very popular game in Russia, and I'm playing it too as well. I love it. It is... it is very complicated, and there are many tables and items, and mainly you're just sitting inside the space station and browse through all the tables, and then maybe you're flying like maybe 5 minutes, and then you come back and start reading and counting and selling and producing and all that stuff. But the game is, well, it's really great. So we have this series, and this is Sci-Fi LitRPG, and this second series of Sci-Fi LitRPG. But I have to say that, of course, science fiction LitRPG is less popular than fantasy. And I'm not sure why this is so, but in Russia, for example, we are having this big fantasy boom. Right. It's mainly young adult fantasy, but still it's fantasy. 10 years ago, it seemed like, all the fantasy is written,
Right.
And what more could you write about dragons and elves and all that stuff? But it comes back today, and today in Russia, and I suppose in United States too, people do prefer fantasy books somehow.
Right.
Wow. Yeah, I got a funny feeling that once the Ready Player One movie comes out, we may see that shift to the more science fiction-oriented stuff.
I think so. Well, so you technically all LitRPG is science fiction, because there is computer games and virtual capsules, all that stuff, and maybe even all LitRPG is cyberpunk. I dare to say. I'm not sure, but maybe it is so in some.
Well, if you go on Amazon, you'll find most LitRPGs, at least originally, were all classified under cyberpunk. They at first didn't know where to put them, and so that's where they put them. Now I believe they have their own category, though. Actually, what I find interesting is that it seems like LitRPGs are really just a variation of Portal Fantasy, which is something that seems to come and go every couple of years, at least in Western culture anyway. And, of course, it's very popular in Japan right now and China.
I agree. Totally. And, well, Portal Fantasy is also very popular in Russia. Not LitRPG, but Portal traveling books, like maybe A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain, the famous book. It's also a Portal fantasy of a kind. Well, and in Russia, there are very, very many books of that sort. Not LitRPGs, but other books. But they are Portal Fantasy, yes.
So these Portal Fantasy books that Russian authors are writing, are they set in Western, like D&D World of Warcraft type settings? Or are they actually set in traditional Russian settings? I mean, I know that the Chinese like to set things in Chinese-based fantasy settings, and the Japanese, not so much. But anyway, so what do the Russian authors like to do?
Well, first of all, you have all different kind of monsters inside of that fantasy. There are no dragons or elves in Russian mythological material. So there are different monsters. There are different plots, of course, and it is based on Slavic mythological material. So they have Slavonic gods or something that reminds of those gods. And traditional Russian heroes, as I told you, the Russian fool who gets lucky all the time, something like that. And of course, it will remind you of a classic fantasy, classic British fantasy and English fantasy as well, because it is still fantasy, still a fantasy. You can't, cut Tolkien's or George R.R. Martin's books out of your head. You always remember about them. You always, pointing at them mentally when you're writing a book. But still, it feels like maybe something different still. And of course, inside these books, you can find more, national behavior and national, view of the world. And it is different, because sometimes Russian sci-fi and fantasy can be a little rough for English reader. I am talking about, political correctness and all that stuff. Sometimes it can be politically incorrect with women rights or LGBT rights. There are plenty of things in Russia which are very old-fashioned. And inside these kind of books on national material, you can find them of all those things, of course, which are a little different than in English novels.
Yes, well, different cultures have different views, for better or worse in some cases. So does that mean Russian fantasy tends to be more on the dark side in terms of content and tone? Or is there more variety in the kinds of fantasy people read?
Well, it depends on the fantasy you pick. There is light fantasy, as I told you, written by young authors, like young adult or romantic fantasy, and it could be family based and uniting, about friendship, about good things, about kindness, all that stuff. And there is hard science fiction, hard fantasy, and it is dark, and it is about conquering. And, this is a very painful question for me, at least, because as you might know, in 2014, Russia invaded in Crimea and took it over. And it was a big and very painful for some Russian people like me episode. But there are not many people like me in Russia, and mostly people in Russia were very happy about this fact, and which is telling me, at least, that Russian people are still missing, the empire, the former empire, the greatness, when all other nations are afraid of you, and they think they mixed it with the respect. They think if they fear you, they respect you. That's not true, but they think that way, and I'm afraid this happens in Russia a little bit more often than I could hope for. Yes, that's it. And of course, Russian science fiction and Russian fantasy reflect all these problems. First of all, because very many Russian science fiction authors are former military, and they are patriotic and people. They love their country, and they approve what our government is doing. And this is very, very sad, but that's just the way it is. But not all, of course. We have different authors and different people. Now, for example, author of Metro 2033, Dmitry Gluchovsky, on which there was this computer game I told you about. He's a liberal. He is multicultural. He speaks 6 or 7 languages. He travels all over the world. He meets people he speaks to them, and of course he's against these conquering actions that Russia took in recent past. So there are different people, and this is a very, very painful matter for any Russian to discuss and to get into, because sometimes, this breaking families, where parents could support those actions, and children growing up on Western culture, on Western traditions, on humanity traditions. They look at things different, and this is source of very, very painful arguing and fights.
Yeah,
Yes.
there are definitely different cultural perspectives about subjects like conquest. I've always found it fascinating how in America they have, of course, Star Trek, and that's all about going out and making friends and peacefully exploring for the most part. But in Germany, there's Per Rhodan, of course, who was kind of German Captain Kirk type figure. But what's interesting about Per Rhodan is that in his stories, they go out into the galaxy and they conquer it. They don't make friends with people. That's not the point. The point is about who is the strongest should rule and should be in control.
Yes, I think that you're right, because, this is kind of a thing that really separates East from the West, I think.
Yeah.
Because, for example, I read recently a Chinese novel which was translated from English. Somehow, I'm not sure why, but it was translated from English. Let me just check how it was called. The Three-Body Problem. Maybe you know it.
Oh,
Yes.
yes. It just won a Hugo Award, actually. It's actually quite well known here.
Yes, it's very popular. For my taste, it's maybe a little dry, but still it's a very good big book, difficult and, complicated. And of course, it is also about conquering. There are aliens that are coming to Earth and try to conquer it, but they are starting conquering it even before they actually coming to Earth. They are making their interest through people on Earth. And this is, of course, this book also describes this problem of conquering, of different approach, to this problem. And on these scales, I think that Russia is, well, at least I hope it is, are more a Western country, of course, because our history from like 15th century is mostly European and not Chinese. And Russian people, they sometimes they do speak English, but they don't speak Chinese. They don't read Chinese books. They don't watch Chinese movies. They don't go to Chinese artists very much, at least. But of course, they do read English and American fantasy and science fiction and other books. I hope that this bond is strong enough to, not to separate our countries one from another in the future. And I hope very much that Russia will keep looking west more than east. And I don't want to say anything, about Chinese or Japanese culture. They are great, and I adore Japanese and Chinese culture very much. It's just that Russian people, of course, they are European by, genetically, by the inner code.
But isn't Russian culture a little bit of a mix of both sides? I mean, you're both an Eastern and Western country, right? And so
Yes.
there's got to be some connection to Asia there.
We are torn apart, not like we are pointing one direction and then we are pointing another direction. We are really torn apart.
But isn't that also an advantage? I mean, you're in the middle between both sides. You can kind of act as a bridge or a broker between the two cultures. You've got elements of both.
That's an opportunity. I hope we will pursue this opportunity in the future. But for now, we have to deal with our own problems, and then maybe we can try to become a bridge or something like that between Western and Eastern cultures.
Well, I hope so. I really think that it would be a waste, and hopefully things will continue to improve in the future. Anyway, so Simon, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and your own work? Are you also a writer? Do you have any projects ongoing right now?
Well, yes, of course. I even have in mind an idea for a litRPG novel, and I'm not sure if I ever will have time to write it down, because it takes really much time, and I got a lot of work with Magic Dome Books and other projects I've been running. But still, I hope that maybe someday I can publish my own novel on Amazon and get reviews and get money, of course. How without it? And I even can give you a little hint about my idea, because I came up with a gaming world, where there is working a reversed law of entropy. But there is reverse entropy in this world. So if you have pieces of broken cup, in time it comes back together in this world.
Huh.
Yes, it comes back together, and this gaming world reflects actions of players inside this world in a very peculiar and weird way. So the world changes all the time with this reverse entropy idea. And, well, I'm working on the plot for that book. And I hope that maybe by autumn or maybe by next winter, I'll have a rough draft of my novel. And I will translate it.
That is a fascinating original
Thank you.
idea.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Reverse entropy. I would never have thought of that myself, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Oh, I think that is going to be a major success.
I hope so, and I hope you publish it on Amazon, translated into English, so we can check it out.
Yeah.
Of course. That was the original idea, of course, because in Russia, if I wrote something like that, I just, published it like 3,000 copies, earned like $1,000 tops, and maybe even less because I'm not a well-known author in Russia. So that would be useless. Not useless at all, but it won't, pay for the efforts I made to create such a book. But on Amazon, with American readers behind me, it's all very different. And American readers, as I understand them, they are really very passionate readers. They are writing hundreds of letters, how they were, mad at some actions of the hero inside our books. On chapter 7, he said this, and I was enraged. And I'm writing to you to say that I'm enraged, and please do something. And they are really very passionate readers, and I love that.
Well, some of them are passionate anyway. They definitely get into it, and you may actually regret what you wish for. But But anyway, so Simon, if it pays so little, how do Russian authors manage to feed themselves and survive?
Well, many of them are having other jobs, simple as that. And there are some authors that are very, very popular, and they can make a living writing and just writing. They have they're publishing many copies, like 20,000. This is a very, very big number of copies in Russia today. And they can make some money, and of course, there are such people. But for Russia, it was very hard to adapt to the idea that modern author is not just author, but he also must, he must speak. He must speak publicly. He must present his books. He must write into social media. He must communicate. Russian authors are introverts. They are looking inside. They are not very communicative. Yes, that's the word. People. So for many of them, it's a very hard job. But some of them, like that Dmitry Gluchovsky I told you about, author of Metro, they are communicative and they speak many languages and they do this amazing, producer work with their books, not just writing them, but also promoting them. And that is just the way it will be in the future. Of course, every author becomes will become manager and producer of his own projects, and that's just the way it is.
I think that's kind of the role of the modern author everywhere, not just Russia. I mean, there's so many people publishing now. Literally everyone and their brother, sister, cousin, and their cousin's dog is publishing at this point, thanks to the ebook revolution. And so as an end result, you have to be bringing something else to the table. You have to be a multifaceted entertainer or business person in some way if you want to succeed in the author game these days. At least that's my take on it.
But I was interviewing some foreign writers. For example, I was interviewing Michael Cunningham and Neil Gaiman, for example, and they are amazing on stage. They are joking, they're kidding around, they are speaking, and everyone is laughing in the audience. And this is a show. True and amazing show, and they are amazing showmen. They are very, very good at that. And of course, every author should think of that and then try that.
Well, not everyone can be Neil Gaiman. Neil Gaiman is,
amazing. And artist also. He always, when he signed books, he always draw a little picture on it, and it's not just cute. It's very. He's really talented. These pictures, they're little, but they're have his own style in them. They looks very peculiar and interesting.
Yes. So Don, any final questions before we go? Anything you want to ask about?
Yeah, I have one odd question.
Sure.
That I've been kind of wondering, because you mentioned The Big Bang Theory, and I'm wondering, how do fans of science fiction and fantasy come across to the average person? Like, are they seen as like weirdos, or is it something that everybody's a little bit into, or how does that go over?
In Russia? Can you repeat that? Maybe I didn't understand it completely.
Okay, well, like here you've got like you've seen The Big Bang Theory.
Okay.
That's the old stereotypical image of a science fiction fan in North America. That they're kind of like a bit of an odd person. They keep to themselves. They're they're really smart but weird. And I'm wondering, do science fiction fans in Russia, are they seen the same way, or are they just seen as like everybody else?
No, I don't think they seem any different from everybody else because every Russian reader is a little geek. He has that geek layer, so somewhere inside him or on him. And there is no, this distinctive social group like geeks in Russia. Of course, there are weird people like geeks, but I don't think they are always fans of science fiction or fantasy. They're just weird. That's it.
Okay, then. On that note, thank you very much, Simon, for coming on the show. It's been an incredible and fascinating look at a culture that we really don't know very much about. I'm afraid here in the West, in Canada anyway, and the United States, we don't really get a good view of what it's like there for the average Russian person, and definitely not for those who are part of the nerdly arts. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Don. It was amazing questions, and I really have a good... thank you.
Yes, and when you finally finish your book, and hopefully you do have the chance, come on the show and talk about it.
Okay. I will keep that in mind.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any questions, please come on to obeythedna.com, our website, and leave questions, and we can pass them along to Simon. Or if you have something else you want to get off your chest, please write to us and let us know. Hope you enjoyed the show. Thanks for listening. Tune in next time. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you'd like to hear more or join the conversation, come visit us at obeythedna.com. You can also find us on iTunes or whatever fine podcast site forgot to lock their back door. So until next time, remember that to master the nerdly arts takes time, practice, and enough Coca-Cola to drop a rhino. See ya! Come on over and join the conversation at obeythedna.com, where you will find show notes and more.